They came to take her daughters at dawn. By noon, a man no one dared speak to had broken every rule he lived by just to stand between them and the law. The knock was hard, 3 sharp raps that rattled the glass in the door, and for a heartbeat, Ruth Adler thought the storm had finally shaken something loose. But it wasn't wind. She knew the rhythm of desperation by now. It came early in the morning, or after dark, when men had time to stew in their authority and decide they'd waited long enough. Ruth barely had time to gather her breath before the door creaked open on its own. The wind shoved it, revealing 2 figures in dark coats. Marshal Reeve stood in the doorway, his gloved hand still raised, his silver star dull with dust. Behind him, a younger man, Deputy Macklin, fidgeted with his holster like he wanted something to go wrong. Ruth stepped forward slowly, shielding the small bodies behind her. June gripped the edge of her mother's skirt, only 10 but already learning how fear felt in the bones. Clara, younger by 2 years, stayed silent. Her tiny hands balled into fists around the hem of her nightgown. "Ruth Adler," the marshal said with no warmth, no pretense of courtesy. "We're here for the girls." It was a sentence she had tried for weeks to prepare for. Still, it knocked the breath from her lungs. "You're not taking them," she said quietly. "Court said otherwise," Reeve replied. He reached into his coat, pulling a folded paper from inside. The seal was cracked. "Signed off yesterday. Custody transferred to the state. They'll be sent to Springhold, fostered separately." Ruth didn't reach for the paper. She didn't need to. She'd known it was coming, the way a farmer knows when a crop's gone sour no matter how long he stares at the dirt. Since Elias died and the debts caught fire around their home like dry grass, the town had turned colder. A woman alone with 2 girls was an invitation for judgment, for decision-making that had nothing to do with kindness. She tried once more. "Just a little more time. I've applied to teach again. I'm working." "You're not making enough," Reeve said flatly. "They don't want to split them, Ruth. But we both know that's what'll happen." Ruth's breath hitched. Behind her, June pressed her face into her back, whispering something too soft to catch. Deputy Macklin stepped forward. "Ma'am, don't make this harder." "I'm not the one making it hard," she snapped, louder than she intended. "I've kept them fed, warm, safe. You think they'll get that bouncing between strangers?" Reeve sighed, almost tired. "That's not my decision. It's the law." For one suspended second, Ruth's hand hovered near the fireplace poker. Not to use it, not really, just to feel something solid. But she dropped it just as fast. She wouldn't scare her girls like that. Wouldn't give them the kind of memory that twisted love into fear. "Can I say goodbye?" she asked. Reeve didn't answer right away. But then he nodded once. "Make it quick." She turned, crouched low, and gathered both girls into her arms. June was trying not to cry. Clara already was. Ruth kissed their foreheads, whispering promises she didn't know how to keep. "I'll find you," she said. "No matter where they send you, I'll come." And then she stood, chest hollow, and stepped aside. But the wind blew harder then, so sharp it nearly took the door off its hinges. And with it came the creak of hooves on the frosted road. Not a patrol, not anyone Ruth expected. She turned, instinctively, squinting past the swirling dust and broken light, and saw the shape of a rider cresting the hill near the pine line. One man, one horse, a silhouette black against the morning gold. Reeve turned too, blinking. "You expecting someone?" Ruth shook her head. The rider came slow, deliberate. He didn't hurry, didn't wave. His duster was the color of old smoke, and his hat cast a shadow across his face. But the town had whispered about him too long for there to be any doubt. Reeve took a step backward. "John Holt," he muttered. Even Macklin flinched. John Holt hadn't been seen in town for months, not since the shootout near Dead Creek, where they said he'd left 3 bounty men bleeding into the sand. He didn't live in Bitter Hollow. He lived past it, beyond the ridge, beyond the law. Alone. Some said he was half mad. Some said he was a killer. Most just said nothing at all. But now he was here. His horse stopped at the edge of Ruth's small yard. Holt dismounted with the unhurried grace of a man who feared nothing in the world. He walked forward, eyes locked on the door, on Ruth, then past her, to the children. Reeve squared his shoulders. "This ain't your business, Holt." John stopped at the porch. "Then you should be gone by now." The silence was razor sharp. "You threatening the law?" Macklin asked, voice cracking just slightly. John didn't answer. He just looked at Ruth. "You got coffee?" he asked. Ruth, stunned, nodded. "Mind if I come in?" It was ridiculous. It was terrifying. But her voice answered before her head caught up. No, I don't mind." John stepped past the marshal without so much as a glance. Reeve reached for his gun, but didn't draw. Not yet. John walked into the kitchen and sat like he'd been invited to Sunday supper, like he'd always belonged here. Ruth followed, hands shaking. She poured coffee, barely aware she was doing it. Behind her, Reeve spoke again, louder now. "This is official business. You harboring interference." John's voice was quiet. "You said yourself, Marshal. They didn't want to split them." "That ain't your call." John sipped the coffee. "Now it is." Macklin stepped forward. "We'll be back with more men." John smiled faintly. "Bring as many as you want." Ruth watched the lawmen retreat. They didn't run, but they didn't look back either. And when the door closed again, she finally asked the question, clawing up her throat. "Why?" she whispered. John looked at the girls, at the hearth, at the photo of Elias on the mantel. Then he said simply, "Because nobody else did." Outside, the wind picked up. In town, word would spread, and Ruth Adler's quiet fight had just become something far louder. Ruth barely slept that night. Not with John Holt asleep in the chair across the kitchen. Not with her daughters curled up on either side of her in bed, like they were trying to keep time from moving forward. The fire had died down to embers. Every time a gust of wind whistled under the boards, she jerked awake, half expecting to see Reeve and his deputy standing at the foot of her bed, guns drawn, paper in hand. But it never happened. Just John, arms crossed, chin tucked, the brim of his hat shadowing a face that didn't look peaceful, only still, like a man holding too much under the surface and refusing to let it rise. When the sun bled orange across the frosted glass, Ruth rose, careful not to wake the girls. She stepped into the kitchen, heart thudding unevenly, and for a moment she just watched him. He looked as if he'd never moved. Then, as if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened. "You snore," he said flatly. Ruth blinked. "Excuse me?" He stood, rolling his shoulders like they ached. "The little one too. Sounds like a freight train." She flushed, crossing her arms. "You're one to talk. You slept with your boots on." "Didn't plan to sleep." "Then, why'd you come?" John tilted his head slightly. "You know why." "No," she replied, voice tightening. "I really don't. You ride down from the ridge, scare off 2 lawmen, and take over my kitchen like you're the second coming. Why, Holt? Why now?" He looked at her then, not just glanced, but really looked, and the quiet between them grew heavier. "You asked them to wait," he said, "and no one listened. That don't sit right." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She opened her mouth to say something more, but a creak from the hallway cut her off. June peeked in, rubbing her eyes with one small fist, her other hand already searching behind her for her sister. Clara stumbled in a beat later, hair wild, voice still full of sleep. "Is he still here?" John gave a small nod. "Morning." Clara stared at him. "Do you shoot people?" Ruth gasped. "Clara!" But John only smiled, faint, fleeting, like something he'd forgotten how to do. "Not lately." Clara blinked. "Why not?" "Too loud. I like quiet." She nodded solemnly, accepting that as gospel, and wandered toward the stove like nothing unusual had happened. John looked back at Ruth. You want to tell them what's coming? Or should I? She bristled. Coming? They'll be back. You know that. Reeve doesn't let things go. And what? You'll just stay here and scare them off again, if that's what it takes. She studied him, arms still crossed. You don't even know us. I don't need to. That's not how the world works. He stepped closer, voice low. Maybe it should be. That silenced her. They ate breakfast mostly in silence. John refused eggs, but took coffee again. Drank it slow, like each sip held something worth remembering. The girls watched him constantly, whispering to each other behind their bowls, wide-eyed and fascinated. It was the most security they'd felt in weeks, and Ruth hated how much she noticed it. Hated that it wasn't her presence giving them that calm, but his. After breakfast, John stepped outside to check on his horse. Ruth followed, wrapping her shawl tight. You don't have to stay. I know, he said without looking at her. Then, why do you? His hand brushed the horse's neck gently. You keep asking questions you already know the answers to. She opened her mouth to protest, but the sound of hooves on the road below stopped her cold. John's head turned sharply. He stepped away from the horse, already scanning the horizon. 2 riders. Fast. Kicking up dust like they meant business. Inside, he said. But, take the girls. Now. There was no time to argue. Ruth ran, calling the girls to her. They obeyed instantly, reading the urgency on her face. By the time she shut the door behind them, John had already drawn his rifle and taken position by the porch rail. The riders slowed as they neared. Reeve and Macklin again, this time without the papers, without pretense, just grit and guns, and the law carved into their brows like a second skin. Reeve didn't dismount. You think you're making a point, Holt, he called out. But all you're doing is delaying the inevitable. John said nothing. You threatening me again? Reeve added. You really want to start something that'll end bloody? John's voice was calm. Didn't start anything. You came here. Macklin spat into the dust. We got 10 deputies ready to ride. All we gotta do is whistle, then whistle. Ruth watched from behind the curtains, heart slamming against her ribs. She could see John's fingers wrapped around the rifle stock, steady as stone. See the tension in Reeve's jaw. The marshal didn't want this fight. Not really. Not here. Not against him. Reeve exhaled slowly. You're making a mistake. John's gaze didn't waver. You made it first. And then, after a long pause, Reeve turned his horse. Macklin hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but he followed. They rode off without another word. Ruth opened the door slowly. You really would have shot him, wouldn't you? If he made me, John said. That's not how things get fixed. John looked at her, his expression unreadable. No, but sometimes it's how they stop getting worse. That night, the whispers started. Not just in town, but in the dry stretches of land where the law had weight and rumours had wings. John Holt had come down from the ridge. John Holt was standing guard at a widow's door. John Holt was protecting children. And some folks didn't like that. Some who'd been waiting for an excuse to test their luck against him. The next visitor came a day later. Not the law, not Reeve. A man named Errol Kane. Ruth recognized him at once. He ran the general store, but everyone knew he had ties to the state orphan office too. He didn't wear a badge, didn't need one. He had paperwork, he said, and authority. John didn't let him pass the fence. I don't care who you are, Kane sneered. This ain't your land, ain't your family. John's reply was quiet. It is now. You're not even married to her. John didn't flinch, but Ruth, who had come out onto the porch behind him, felt her breath catch. Is that what it takes now? John asked. A signature to keep blood together? Kane straightened his coat. I'm giving you 3 days. Then I'm coming back with a state order. Ruth didn't speak until the man was gone, didn't breathe right either. She stared at John. You heard him. I did. And? We've got 3 days. And then what? She snapped. You shoot again? Scare them off with a look? You can't hold off the world forever. No, he said. That's why we change it. Ruth's heart was pounding. You don't just change the system. John looked her dead in the eyes. Then we make a new one. It was madness. And yet, in the days that followed, something began to shift. People came, not many and not loud, but they came. Mrs. Wexley brought stew. Thomas Parnell, the old blacksmith, offered wood for the hearth. A boy from the edge of town dropped off eggs and ran before anyone saw him. It wasn't enough to stop the state, but it was enough to make Ruth's throat ache. The town wasn't just watching anymore, it was choosing. And that night, after the girls were asleep, John stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching the wind. Ruth stepped beside him. You're not staying forever, she said. No, then what are you doing? He was quiet for a long time. I buried someone once, he said. Someone who never got the help she needed, because everyone thought she was fine, strong, said she could manage. I waited too long. So now I don't... Wait. The quiet stretched between them again. Ruth looked at him differently now. Not just the shadowed outline of a feared man, but something else. A wound walking on 2 feet. A man who had lost more than he ever admitted. She didn't touch him. Didn't need to, because in that moment, the truth was loud enough without either of them saying another word. By the second morning, Ruth woke not to dread, but to motion. Soft humming, the scrape of a chair leg, the smell of something cooking that hadn't come from her hands. She stepped into the kitchen to find Clara balancing on a stool, stirring a pot while John crouched by the stove, adding more kindling to the fire like he'd done it 100 times before. June sat at the table, braiding a length of thread through a button-up doll whose eyes had long since been rubbed off. Ruth blinked, hard. She hadn't seen her daughters this quiet, this focused, since before the letters started coming. Before the word separation had become a ghost trailing them through every hallway. Clara glanced over and grinned. He said I can help if I don't burn anything. John didn't turn. Still waiting to see if she holds up her end. Ruth smiled faintly, then stepped out onto the porch, needing air, needing to breathe past the tightness in her chest that wasn't fear anymore, just the weight of knowing what would come next. The breeze carried a scent of wet pine and old wood smoke. Her boots crunched frost as she crossed the yard, gaze drifting toward the hill beyond town, where the law watched from a distance, and men like Errol Kane counted minutes like vultures. 3 days. That's what Kane had given them. She knew what happened when the state came for children. Paperwork didn't care about sisters. Bureaucrats didn't lose sleep over names. June would go to one family, Clara another. If they were lucky, they might end up in the same county. If they were lucky. But Ruth had never been lucky. She'd been loved once, by a man with kind hands and a laugh that filled their walls with warmth. But he died beneath a wagon wheel 3 winters back, and luck hadn't touched her since. By the time she returned inside, John had poured 2 cups of coffee and left one at her place at the table. No word, no look, just the steam curling up like a quiet offering. They ate together. The girls giggled, made a mess of their plates, forgot to be afraid. Ruth watched John, noticed how he didn't talk much, but always listened. How he refilled cups without being asked. How he looked out the window every few minutes, like the past might try sneaking up from the trees. After the dishes were done, John stood and walked to the doorway, glancing back just once. Town's got ears, he said. I'll go see what they're hearing. Ruth nodded, suddenly aware of how big the house would feel with him gone. He saddled his horse and rode off without another word, disappearing down the trail toward town. Ruth kept herself busy scrubbing dishes that didn't need scrubbing and sorting clothes the girls had long outgrown. But by midday, her hands shook, her jaw clenched, and she knew if she stayed inside a second longer, she'd drown in the silence. So she bundled the girls and hitched up the old cart, deciding it was time they showed their faces again. Let the town see they weren't hiding. Let them see Ruth Whelan still had something to fight for. The main road stretched wide and empty as she drove, the cartwheels wobbling slightly with each stone they hit. She passed the blacksmiths. Parnell raised a hand. She passed the bakery. Mrs. Loxley peered from the curtains. And when she reached the general store, she spotted Errol Kane on the steps, talking with two men she didn't recognize. Clean coats, stiff hats, outsiders. Her throat dried. She clicked the reins, ready to pass without stopping. But Clara called out suddenly, "Mama! The sweet drawer!" Ruth hesitated. Kane turned, and before she could think twice, she was climbing down, lifting both girls out with arms that barely obeyed her. Kane stepped forward. "Brave of you. Just shopping," she said evenly. "For now." He nodded toward the two men. "Meet Mr. Dugan and Mr. Price, state supervisors, got papers in hand, ready and proper." The taller of the two nodded once. "We'll be back tomorrow, ma'am. That clock don't stop just because you're sentimental." Ruth's spine stiffened. "They're not objects." "No, ma'am," Price replied. "They're wards of the state. Big difference." She didn't answer. She pushed past them into the store, her hands trembling as she gripped the girl's shoulders. Inside, the usual smells of flour and tobacco wrapped around her, comforting in a strange way. Mr. Harlan, the clerk, gave her a soft nod, already bagging her usual. As she fumbled with coins, she heard a voice from the door, low, measured, unmistakable. "Looks like you're short a day." John stepped in, his presence soaking the room like storm clouds. Everyone froze. Even Kane's expression slipped for just a moment into something almost unsure. John looked at the two state men. "Don't recall seeing your badges." "We don't need—" "You're on private land tomorrow," John cut in. "If you step foot past her gate, that's trespassing." Price stepped forward. "We have state authorization." "Then come back with the marshal. I'd love to hear what Reeve thinks of you bypassing him." Silence. And then Kane laughed, short and bitter. "You think this'll end with a stare-down, Holt? This isn't some saloon brawl. This is legal. You can't shoot paperwork." John didn't smile. "I don't need to." That night, the town buzzed louder. People whispered from porches and behind shutters. Ruth tucked the girls in tight, then stood outside by the woodpile, chopping what little was left, swinging the axe like she meant to break something that couldn't be split. John came out quietly, taking the axe from her hands without a word. "I'm not helpless," she said, breathless. "Didn't say you were." She crossed her arms. "You're not going to be able to stop this. You know that, right?" He split, a log clean. "Maybe not." "Then what are we doing?" He paused, eyes flicking up to hers, making sure they remember it. And somehow, that felt like something. Not victory, but defiance. Not safety, but meaning. The next morning brought snow, thin, early snow, barely more than a dusting, but enough to hush the air and draw every eye toward the Ridge Road. And down that road came Reeve, two deputies, the two state men, and Errol. Kane at the front like a general leading his siege. Ruth didn't speak, didn't blink. She stood in the doorway with her daughters behind her and John at her side. The wind bit through their clothes, but none of them moved. Reeve dismounted slowly, hand resting on his belt. "This ain't about sides," he called. "Out. It's about law." John stepped forward. "Law without mercy isn't justice. It's just control." "Don't talk to me about mercy," Reeve snapped. "You killed men for less than this." "Then maybe I'm trying something different." Reeve looked past him at Ruth. "You can end this right now. Let the girls go quiet. Clean. No trouble. They get placed in good homes. Separated maybe, but safe." Ruth's voice cracked, but her words were clear. "They're already in a good home." Kane stepped forward, holding out the order. "Final warning. If you don't comply, we're authorized to—" John raised his rifle, not aimed, not shaking. "Just ready." Reeve drew his breath through his teeth. You really want to die for this? No, John said, but I'll live for it. And before any more could be said, a sound rolled up from behind. The creak of wagons, the clop of hooves. The townsfolk, one by one, they arrived. Parnell with a hammer in hand, Mrs. Loxley with a Bible, Harlan, the boy who'd brought eggs. They stood behind Ruth, behind John, a line of quiet defiance stretching across the yard. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Reeve looked at them all, jaw tightening. You're making a mistake. Then let history judge it, John replied. For a long beat, no one moved. And then Reeve nodded once, tight, cold. Let's go. He turned his horse. The others hesitated, but followed. When they were gone, Ruth exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The girls clung to her, wide-eyed and trembling, and she knelt to kiss their foreheads. But the relief didn't last, because not everyone left. Errol Kane remained. He stared at them, something dangerous curling in his lips. This ain't over, he said, and with that, he turned and walked off on foot, vanishing into the snow. Ruth looked at John, and for the first time since he'd arrived, John looked afraid. That night, the sky pressed down like a lid. The wind had changed, colder than before, restless. Ruth couldn't sleep. She sat in the rocker near the hearth, both girls asleep on the braided rug, curled against each other under quilts. Across the room, John sat with his back to the wall, rifle across his knees, his eyes sharp even in the dim light. The fire snapped low, but neither of them moved to stoke it. Neither of them wanted to be the first to break the silence. She spoke eventually, not because she wanted to, but because fear left no room for silence. He's not done. John didn't look at her. I know. Do you think He glanced at the sleeping girls, then back to the fire. I think Errol Kane's the kind of man who hates not getting his way more than he loves any law. So yes, I think he'll come back. Her fingers tightened around the mug she hadn't touched. And then what? John's jaw ticked, just once. Then we'll deal with it. But Ruth didn't want to deal with it. She didn't want violence or standoffs or her daughters waking to the sound of gunfire. She wanted peace, a quiet life. Something solid she could promise them after all the things she'd failed to protect them from. But that kind of life didn't come freely. It had to be built, bought with something harder than money. It had to be fought for. The girls stirred once in the night, both calling out, not in fear, but in sleep, like they were dreaming of something that wasn't nightmare for once. Ruth laid a hand on their backs, felt their breath against her palm. She hadn't realized how much smaller they seemed lately, how much quieter. By morning, the town had changed again. Where once there had been whispers, now there were lines drawn. Neighbors eyed each other in the street. Some crossed to Ruth's side, emboldened by yesterday's stand. Others looked away when she passed, guilt in their faces, or worse, resentment. The town had always tolerated her. Her husband's name had once meant something after all. But now, she was something else. A disruption, a challenge. John walked beside her and the girls as they entered the chapel. They didn't speak on the way in, but when they sat in the back pew, Ruth felt something settle. The preacher gave no sermon that morning. Instead, he invited those with prayers to share them aloud. An old tradition, one mostly fallen out of use. But something about it felt fitting. Maybe it was the tension. Maybe it was the cold. I pray, the blacksmith said, rising slowly, for wisdom in the face of men who confuse cruelty with righteousness. I pray, said Mrs. Loxley, standing beside her cane, that children never again be treated as spoils of bureaucracy. And then Ruth surprised herself by rising too. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't even shake. I pray, she said, that fear doesn't win. Not in my home, not in this town, not while my daughters are still watching. No one spoke after that, not for a while. John didn't say a word the whole way home. But when they reached the cabin, he paused at the door, waiting for the girls to rush inside, then turned to her. They'll come at night. Ruth nodded. I know. We need to be ready. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. Ruth gathered blankets, food, stashed what she could in the root cellar in case they needed to hide. John moved through the house like a shadow, boarding windows, reinforcing the front door, setting up trip lines in the trees along the trail. He never raised his voice, never hurried, just moved like a man who'd done this before, like he knew exactly what shape danger took when it came calling. By dusk, the house was a fortress in miniature, and Ruth hated every inch of it. She sat the girls down before nightfall and told them stories. Old ones. Not about brave men with guns or battles won, but about clever girls who outsmarted wolves, sisters who found each other through forests of lies and dark paths. June listened with her chin on her knees. Clara played with the edge of her braid, nodding along. Neither asked why the stories felt so heavy tonight. Maybe they knew. Then the sun dipped below the ridge, and silence came again. Not the peaceful kind, but the waiting kind. The kind that presses in around your ribs and makes the air feel thick. Ruth stood by the front window, watching shadows crawl over the snow. John sat by the door, rifle in hand, knife at his belt, breath steady. It came fast. A single shot, far off, then another, closer. Not aimed. Warnings. Ruth pulled the girls close, heart thudding. They're pushing, John murmured. Testing. Who'll run? A pause. Then boots on gravel. The crunch of movement in the trees. Multiple footsteps. No horses. They wanted to come quiet. John stood, motioned Ruth and the girls back toward the rear room. Stay low. Stay quiet. But Clara whimpered, grabbing his coat. Don't let them take us. He knelt, face level with hers. Not while I breathe. The front door shuddered once. Then again, a voice called out. Kane. Whelan. We gave. You time. We offered kindness. Ruth opened her mouth, but John stepped forward. You offered threats wrapped in polite words. We declined. Another pause. Then Kane snarled. You think these people will keep backing you when you draw blood? In their name. You think they'll keep you warm when the cold sets in and you've made enemies of the only power left? We'll see, John said. Then the third hit. A battering force. The door cracked. Ruth pulled the girls to the floor, covering them. As John raised his weapon, the door burst open, but it wasn't Kane who stepped through. It was Dugan, one of the state men, alone, pale, shaking. He held up both hands. Wait! Don't shoot! I didn't come for that. John's aim didn't waver. You're not welcome here. I know, Dugan gasped. I didn't come for the kids. I came to warn you. John frowned. Warn us? They're not waiting for a court order. Kane paid off someone in the county records office. There's a falsified seizure notice. He's going to use it to take the whole property, tonight. And if you resist, he's got men ready to say you fired first. John lowered the rifle just slightly. Why tell us? Dugan swallowed hard. Because I've seen what happens to kids in the system when men like Kane are involved. I ain't part of that. I won't be. Ruth stepped forward. So what do we do? John's eyes were already scanning the window. We move. Where? She asked. To the only place Kane won't follow. Ruth's heart dropped. The mines. John nodded. The mines had been sealed for years. Old shafts, too unstable for work, too deep for rescue if something went wrong. But they were beyond the county border, outside Kane's jurisdiction, and more importantly, a place no one would willingly walk into. They packed in minutes, bundled the girls, took what food they could carry. John led them on foot through the trees, taking the back trail most didn't know existed. Dugan stayed behind, promising to slow anyone who followed. Whether he would or could, none of them knew. Snow fell again as they climbed, soft but relentless, covering their tracks almost as soon as they made them. The girls didn't cry, didn't ask questions. They just held tight to Ruth's hands, trusting her in a way that broke her heart. By the time they reached the ridge, night had swallowed the world whole. The mine entrance loomed like the mouth of a dead god, black and silent. John pulled back the old boards, revealing the narrow tunnel. "I'll go first," he said. "Step where I step. No light, just your hands on the wall." Ruth nodded, heart thudding. She took June's hand. June took Clara's. And one by one, they stepped into the dark. The cold was instant. The silence louder than any gunshot. Ruth couldn't see her feet, could barely hear John's movements ahead. But they walked. For what felt like hours, they walked until suddenly John stopped. "Here." He struck a match. Dim orange light revealed a hollow, dry, stable, barely large enough for the four of them. Old supplies littered the space. Cots, cans. Someone had hidden here once before. Ruth collapsed onto the floor, clutching the girls as John started a tiny fire in a circle of stones. The light danced across their faces. For a moment it felt like safety, but just as she exhaled, John's head snapped toward the tunnel. Ruth heard it too. A sound. Far off. Boots. Coming closer. The footsteps echoed with eerie precision, each one striking the stone floor of the mine like the ticking of a clock winding towards something inevitable. Ruth didn't move. She pulled Clara tighter, her hand finding June's wrist in the dark. The fire John had built was so small it barely lit the hollow, but now it seemed like a beacon. Too loud, too bright, too obvious. John doused it with his boot in one swift motion. Darkness fell again like a shroud. He pressed a hand against the wall and crouched low, motioning silently for them to do the same. The girls obeyed without sound. Ruth's knees trembled, but she bent low beside them. The cold from the ground seeped into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the ice rising through her veins. There was no turning back, no trail to follow, no cavalry coming over the ridge. It was just them. Them and whoever had decided to follow into the mouth of the earth. The steps grew louder, closer, but still deliberate. One man, maybe two. No, shouting. No torches yet. John tilted his head, listening intently. Ruth could see the profile of his face in what little glow remained. His jaw was tight, his breathing silent. He reached into his coat and drew a knife. Long, black-handled, wickedly sharp, and slid it into his palm like he'd done it 100 times before. Then, the steps stopped. Silence. A pause stretched too long. Ruth strained to hear more, to pick out breathing, movement, anything, but the mind swallowed every sound whole. She wondered if the men had gotten lost, if they were standing just around a bend, waiting, if they were listening too. And then came the voice, soft, almost conversational. "I know you're in here." It wasn't Kane. It wasn't Dugan either. "I ain't here to take the kids. I ain't here to hurt no one. I just want to talk." John didn't move. Ruth could feel the girls holding their breath beside her. "My name's Ellis," the voice said. "Used to work these tunnels before they shut 'em down. Used to drink with your husband, Miss Lorne." "Good man." Ruth stiffened. "I got no dog in this fight. Kane offered me coin to come flush you out. That's all. But I seen enough of what he does to know I don't want that weight on my soul. I'll walk away right now. But you gotta know, he ain't giving up. He's calling in favors all across the county. Judges, sheriffs, anyone who'll sign a paper or pull a trigger." John stood then, slow and silent, and stepped just far enough forward that Ruth could barely make out the shape of him. "You walk now, and you don't say a word to anyone about where we went," John said, voice low and firm. "And you keep that soul of yours clean." "A beat. I'll say I didn't find nothing but bats and ghosts," Ellis replied. "But you should run, tonight, before Kane gets desperate. And then, retreating steps, fading. Ruth waited, counting each one. When the sound finally vanished into the black, she exhaled hard and fast, her knees buckling beneath her. The girls sagged too, collapsing into her arms. John didn't move. His knife remained in hand. "He was telling the truth," Ruth whispered. "Maybe. But Cain won't send only one man. Next time it won't be a warning." "What do we do now?" she asked, voice cracking. "We can't run forever. We're not even criminals, John. We're just trying to live," he finished. His eyes met hers in the dark. They both knew it. The game had changed. It was never just about Clara and June. It was about the message. Cain couldn't afford to look weak, and Ruth had made him look foolish. Standing up in the chapel, winning neighbors to her side, refusing to hand her children over. He wouldn't stop. Not until she was broken, her name erased, her daughters scattered. So they stayed in the mine one more night. John stood watch while the girls drifted to sleep, curled in their mother's arms. Ruth didn't sleep. She stared at the jagged rock above, thoughts churning like a storm river. By dawn, she'd made a decision. They would go back. Not to the cabin. Not to hide. To town. To the heart of it. John argued at first. "You walk into that courthouse and he'll bury you in red tape so deep you'll choke before you find your way out." "He wants fear," Ruth said. "So I'm giving him defiance." She stood straighter. "You said it yourself. He needs power. He needs people to see him win. If we show the town we're not afraid, if we walk in with our heads high, with truth behind us maybe, just maybe, someone with real power will start listening." John watched her for a long time. "You're braver than me." "No," she said quietly. "I'm just a mother." They waited until late morning before emerging. The snow had stilled. The town loomed ahead, grey and quiet under a pale sky. As they entered the square, heads turned. Doors cracked open, eyes widened. Ruth walked ahead of John, each daughter holding one of her hands. Clara looked up at her and whispered, "Mama, are we going to jail?" Ruth bent low. "We're going to tell the truth." Inside the courthouse, Cain was already there. He stood near the clerk's desk, a rolled document in one hand, and when he saw them walk in, his eyes flared with disbelief, then fury. "Well," he said slowly, "would you look at that?" Ruth stopped 10 feet away. "We're not running anymore. You're trespassing on county property. We're here to file a claim," John cut in. Cain blinked. "A claim?" John stepped forward and dropped a packet of papers onto the desk. "This is a notarized affidavit of illegal seizure threat per County Code Section 1405 signed by Ellis Murney, stating that you offered him coin to remove minors by force." The clerk blinked. "Furthermore," John said, producing another page, "this includes affidavits from 4 townspeople, Mrs. Loxley the blacksmith, Deputy Hart, and Preacher Miles, all testifying to your conduct in recent weeks." Cain's face lost colour. "You think this'll stick?" he snarled. "You think you can bring me down with paper and sympathy?" "I think," Ruth said, stepping up. "You made one mistake too many. You went after my daughters." Behind them, the door creaked. 3 figures entered, Deputy Hart, Preacher Miles, and a man Ruth didn't recognize until John whispered, "The circuit judge." Cain spun to face him. "What the hell is this?" The judge raised a hand. "An investigation. You'll stand down, Mr. Cain, until we sort this. You've got no right." "I've got every right," the judge snapped. "And if you continue obstructing, I'll have you removed." Ruth didn't breathe. For one long moment, it seemed Cain might lunge. His fists clenched. His eyes darted toward the girls, toward John, toward the judge. Then, without a word, he threw the packet of papers onto the ground and stormed past them, slamming the door behind him. Relief didn't come immediately. It came slow, staggered. The judge spent hours reviewing documents, questioning everyone. Ruth was pulled aside multiple times. So was John. But no one cracked. No one backed down. By sunset, Kane was suspended pending a formal hearing. It wasn't jail. It wasn't permanent, but it was something. Outside, the town buzzed with whispers. Ruth and the girls stood in the square, not quite knowing what to do next. Then Mrs. Loxley appeared, holding out a wrapped parcel. "Bread," she said. "Still warm." Behind her, the blacksmith raised 2 fingers in a nod. The schoolteacher smiled. Others followed. Nods, small gestures, quiet things. But they mattered. John stood off to the side, watching all of it like a man who didn't know how to step into it. Ruth crossed to him. "You don't have to go." He looked at her, brow furrowed. Wasn't planning on it. She hesitated. "Not just tonight. I mean after. You don't have to go." He studied her, the girls, the town. Then, finally, he said, "We'll see." But she saw something shift in his face. Not a promise, but the beginning of one. The wind had changed by morning. It carried a bite now, dry and sharp, like something was coming that didn't know how to announce itself kindly. Ruth felt it the moment she stepped out of the boarding house, Clara and June tucked close against her sides. The courthouse doors had closed the evening before, and though Kane had stormed off without chains or punishment, the fact that he had stormed off at all meant something. For the first time since Nathaniel's funeral, Ruth didn't feel like she was walking uphill with every breath. People had looked her in the eye. The whispers weren't cruel. No one had spit near her boots or muttered about witch widows. And yet, under all that, still something cold moved, like the quiet just before the sky split open. John didn't say anything about it. He stood at the corner, hands in his coat, eyes steady. He looked like he'd been up all night, but not tired. Watchful, ready. There was a strange calm about him now, like he'd finally stepped into the role he'd never wanted, and it fit him more than he'd expected. Not just a guardian, not just a wanderer, something in between. "We'll eat at the inn," Ruth said. "Then we go see Deputy Hart. If there's going to be a hearing, I want to know when and where." John nodded. He didn't mention the others, Kane's friends in nearby towns, the private men with quiet knives and no names who might still be waiting for a chance. He didn't have to. The girls were quieter than usual, both of them keeping their eyes on the street like it might turn on them at any second. And by noon, Ruth knew why. The crowd started small, a few men on the far side of the square, then more. Women she didn't recognize, older men with papers in their hands, talking low and fast. Then came the bark of horseshoes, 3 riders, heads bent, coats flapping hard against their sides. Not lawmen, not Kane, but trouble. Ruth pulled the girls behind her. John stepped in front without speaking. One of the riders veered off down an alley, the other 2 pulling up near the old post office where Kane's office used to be, before he tried to climb the county ladder. They dismounted, one of them carrying a satchel that sagged heavy with something metal. "They're filing counterclaims," Deputy Hart muttered, appearing beside them. "It's not just Kane now. He's called in 2 landholders from Blue Hollow and 1 merchant from Maybury, all saying you're endangering the children. They're making it look like concern, not vengeance. They want to bury us in paperwork," John said. Hart nodded grimly. "And delay the hearing. Maybe long enough for Kane to regain leverage." Ruth's voice was steady. "Will the judge see through it?" "He might, but if the pressure keeps building..." "We don't have time to hope," John cut in. "We need to go to the judge directly. Now." Hart blinked. "He's 2 towns over by now, left this morning on the circuit. Next nearest court is 3 days out." John swore under his breath. That cold wind returned, sharper now. Ruth clutched Clara's hand, then June's. "If they win, if they get any one of these new claims to stick..." "They won't," John said, more to her than to Hart. "Not while I breathe." But his voice lacked its usual steel. Even he knew the game was shifting again. No longer a question of who was right, but who could last longest. That night, they stayed with Mrs. Loxley. The old woman had cleared out the back room of her home, laying out quilts and a tin stove, filling their bowls with stew that steamed and smelled faintly of rosemary. The girls slept soundly for the first time in days. Ruth sat by the window, watching the dark, her nerves too frayed for rest. John joined her after midnight, carrying a folded paper. He didn't speak at first, just handed it over. It was a letter from Ellis. He'd gone south, back to where his sister lived, but he'd left word with the telegraph station. He'd heard of another woman in Kane's path, a widow named Bet Ashby, who'd lost her boy 2 years back. Kane had tried to seize her property under the same guise, concern for her well-being. Ellis had spoken to her. She'd agreed to testify if needed. "She's real," John said softly. I checked. Hope, a thread, but strong enough to hold on to. Ruth folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her coat. In the morning, they set out again. Not away this time, but deeper in. House to house, shop to shop. Ruth spoke to anyone who'd listen. Not pleading, just telling the truth. Not about revenge or bitterness, but about what it meant to wake up with your children in your arms and go to bed not knowing if someone might steal them away with ink and lies. John didn't say much, but his presence was louder than any speech. The townspeople listened. Some nodded, some didn't. But something shifted. And then, 3 days later, the judge returned. He called an emergency hearing. The courthouse packed, fast. Not everyone could fit. Some stood at the windows, others out on the steps. Ruth held her breath as each party was called forward. Kane, calm and coiled, acting as though this was just routine. The 2 landholders beside him, clutching, papers, the merchant too, all presenting carefully written arguments about concern and the public good. Then it was Ruth's turn. She stepped forward. But before she could speak, someone else did. "I have something to say." It was Bet Ashby. She limped forward, one hand on a cane, the other holding a folded letter. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I was threatened 2 winters back. Told I'd be safer with my land in someone else's name. Told it was for my own protection. Mr. Kane offered his help in exchange for a signature. I lost the deed. My boy had been gone 6 months. I had no fight left, but I watched what he did after, to others. Now I see he's trying again." The judge leaned forward. "Are you saying your property was unlawfully seized?" "I'm saying it was coerced, just like what he tried with Miss Lorne." Kane shot to his feet. "This is hearsay." The judge slammed his gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Kane." And then more came. Mrs. Loxley stood. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, even Hart stepped forward, showing copies of reports, signed and dated. And John stepped forward last. He spoke of what he'd seen, what he'd protected, not in grand language, but in words that felt like they'd been carved from the same stone as the man himself. When it was over, the room was silent. Then the judge spoke. "All claims against Miss Lorne are dismissed." Cheers rose. Soft at first, then louder. "But," the judge added, "this court will be reviewing Mr. Kane's position and prior dealings. Effective immediately, he is barred from filing further guardianship claims pending investigation." Kane didn't speak, didn't shout. He simply turned, eyes burning, and walked out into the cold without a word. The next few days were a blur. People stopped Ruth in the street. Children came up to Clara and June to offer ribbons or marbles or chalk. John fixed the porch steps at the boarding house. Mrs. Loxley taught Ruth how to bake rye bread. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, but it felt like healing. One evening, Ruth sat with John on the porch as the sun dipped low. Clara and June were chasing moths in the yard, their laughter high and bright. "You'll leave soon," Ruth said. He looked at her, surprised. "You were never meant to stay," she added. "You've got the road in you. I see it. I've always seen it." He didn't reply right away. Then, maybe not. Ruth turned toward him. You've done enough. More than enough. He didn't move, just looked out at the girls. A softness in his face she'd only seen once before, when he first saw them sleeping safe in the mine. I'm not sure where else I'd go, he said quietly. The words hung there between them, unfinished, unpolished, but full of something real. Then, from the road came the thunder of hooves. One rider, fast. Clara and June stopped running. Ruth stood. The horse skidded to a stop in the dust. A boy, barely 16, waved a telegram. Message for Miss Lorne, he panted. Urgent. Ruth stepped forward, took the envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it. One line. He's not done. Watch the girl. Her heart seized. The girl. Which one? She spun around. June was gone. She didn't remember screaming, but her throat was raw. Ruth's boots pounded across the yard, past the porch where John had already leapt off in a dead sprint. Clara shouted something behind her, but Ruth didn't stop. Couldn't. June had. Been there, playing, spinning in little circles like she always did when dusk made the moths come low and lazy, and now she was gone. Not wandered. Not hiding. Gone. John reached the far edge of the field first. The trees past Mrs. Loxley's house sat still and dark, and the boy who delivered the telegram was frozen in place, white as snow. Who gave? This to you, John barked, voice low and fierce. The boy stammered. A man, tall, with a scar right here. He pointed to his temple. Said to run fast, said it was for Miss Lorne and she'd know what it meant. John didn't need more. He turned toward the trees and vanished into them like a shadow born from fear itself. Ruth was half a breath behind, lungs burning, vision wild. She didn't know if she could run faster, but she had to. The sound of Clara crying was just background now, like wind or leaves. Her baby was gone. Again. And this time, she might not come back. They found the ribbon first. Pale blue, snagged on a branch, trembling in the breeze. Then a footprint, small, pressed deep in the mud near the creek bend. She was carried, John said tightly, scanning the ground. She struggled. Look there, broken bark, heel drag. Ruth followed his finger. She couldn't speak. Her hands were shaking too much. She's close, he said. We're not too late. How can you know that? She rasped. He met her eyes. Because if he wanted her dead, he wouldn't have sent the warning. They moved fast. Deeper into the trees, through the dense underbrush where light thinned and air thickened. Ruth had never known fear like this. Not when Nathaniel died. Not when Cain came with his ink-stained lies. This was different. A mother's fear. Not just for life, but for the soul of the child that might be taken into something black and twisted if she didn't get there in time. Then a voice. Soft, cracked, but clear. Let me go. Ruth lunged toward it, stumbled, caught herself on a root. John's hand steadied her. They crept closer, and the woods opened into a hollow where a fire crackled low beside a bent figure. He sat with his back to them, hat pulled low, June held in front of him like a shield. I knew you'd come, the man said, voice slow, dry. John stepped out first. Let her go, Tilla. That name hit Ruth like ice. Tilla Cray, one of Cain's old deputies. He'd vanished years ago after an ambush gone wrong. Folks said he'd died or fled south. But here he was, face cut, scar running along his scalp, smiling like a man who'd been waiting far too long in the dark. She's got pretty eyes, he said, stroking June's hair. Like her daddy, right? Heard all about him. Nathaniel Lorne, the golden boy. Let her go, Ruth said, her voice like a knife. You don't want to hurt her. I don't. Tilla grinned wider. 'Cause I think hurting her might just break you in all the ways Cain never could. John moved then, fast, a blur. Tilla tried to twist, but he wasn't quick enough. June fell back into Ruth's arms as John tackled the man, both of them hitting the dirt hard. The fire snapped, sending sparks into the trees. Ruth grabbed June and ran so hard her legs nearly gave out. Behind her, the sounds of fists, groans, branches breaking, then silence. John appeared seconds later, bleeding from the brow, chest heaving. "He's not dead," he said, "but he won't be waking up soon." Ruth couldn't speak. She was holding June so tight the child could barely breathe, but the girl didn't complain. She just cried and buried her face in her mother's coat. That night, they didn't sleep. The town was waiting when they came back. Word had spread. The judge, Hart, even the merchant from Maybury, who'd withdrawn his name from Cain's petition, after hearing what Tiller had done. It should have been over. But morning brought the storm. Cain returned. He rode in flanked by two men neither Hart nor the judge recognized. They weren't from this county, weren't law, but they had papers, new ones, signed under a different jurisdiction, claiming John was a known criminal and Ruth an accomplice. Fraud, child endangerment, fabricated, every word, but stamped and official looking. "You can't win in court," Cain said, standing in the middle of the town square, "but you can lose everything before the court arrives." Hart tried to intervene. The judge tried to mediate. But the men with Cain were paid for chaos, not justice. They reached for their belts. John was faster. This time, there was violence. Not a gunfight, not a shootout, just two quick blows. One man down, groaning in the dirt, the other bleeding from the mouth, weapon kicked aside. John didn't draw. He didn't need to. His fists did the talking, and the town backed him. Then Ruth stepped forward, holding up Tiller's knife, still stained. "This was your plan?" she asked Cain. "Steal my child, break my home, lie to a judge?" Cain sneered. "No judge cares about poor widows and bastard brats." The slap came so fast, it silenced the square. Ruth stood there, hands still raised, chest heaving. "This town cares," she said, and behind her, the town stood. One by one, Mrs. Loxley, Hart, the judge, Clara, even the merchant from Maybury, Cain, turned. No one followed him. He left alone, and this time, he didn't come back. Days passed. The courthouse withdrew all claims. Hart was made interim sheriff. Ruth was granted full and undisputed custody of Clara and June. John's name was cleared. The papers from Cain's allies were proven false. Tiller was taken away to stand trial. But more than that changed. Ruth was no longer the widow folks whispered about. She became someone children waved to, someone invited to teach sewing at the school, someone folks asked for help or advice. Not because she'd married someone powerful, not because she begged for approval, but because she'd stood, fought, survived. And John, he didn't leave. He didn't even pack. He stayed. Not loudly, not with grand declarations, just quietly, building a new fence, helping Hart patrol, reading to Clara when she was sick, teaching June how to carve animals from wood, sitting beside Ruth at dusk, neither of them speaking much, because sometimes silence said more than words ever could. One night, Ruth stood on the porch, arms folded, watching the stars. John came up beside her. "I should have left," he said. "You didn't." He nodded. "Never thought I'd stop running." She turned toward him. "Me neither." And then, quietly, "Maybe that's what love is." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next spring, they married under the old tree behind Mrs. Loxley's house. Clara wore flowers in her hair. June cried the whole time. Not because she was sad, but because she'd never thought a heart could be so full it hurt. And from that day on, they weren't a widow and her daughters. They weren't orphans and a loner. They were a family, a strange one, a broken one, but a family. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.